Today I'll be talking about my divorce. So how did I end up in a divorce within the same 24 hours that my husband was charged with murder? Despite all the prison sentences, the life of crime that was involved, me accepting everything, it still didn't work out. People want to sit there and know your business and sit there and gossip in the temple. Alcohol abuse, drug abuse, everything involved. He actually said, "Oh, the gangster's moles here." I just first wanted to smack the guy in the face. And it might sound ridiculous to somebody else, but I would rather he'd beat the shit out of me. It's a ticking time bomb. It's blamed on drug and alcohol abuse. You become an enabler. Then it's okay to say, like, I'm sorry when you're sober and you're not going to do it again. Stop it there a minute, Ed. God.
So whenever you're ready, you can start with introducing yourself, the topic, what we're going to talk about today, and just go into your story. Whenever you're ready.
Hi, I'm Rami. Today I'll be talking about my divorce and how I ended up in a divorce. I've decided to talk about my journey as a woman, to share my experiences with you all. It's not a platform that I've created to give anybody any kind of advice or any misconceptions about anything. This is me talking about my experiences and how I handled it and what I actually went through. There's a lot of misconceptions about who I really am and what actually really did go on in my life. So for those of you that don't know me, I got married quite young. I met my husband when I was 17, going on 18, and we were together nearly 30 years. And then we ended up divorcing soon after my daughter got married. So how did I end up in a divorce? A lot of people ask me, and this is a repetitive question that keeps coming up recently. How did a modern-looking Indian woman like you ended up in a divorce? This is a different phase of your life. You guys should have been on to the next chapter of your life now. So how? Because on the outside, it looked like everything was perfect and, you guys were so happy. What nobody does understand or know the truth about the depth of what was going on underneath. And I think we tend to hide a lot about what we're really going through and don't really talk about it. And it's taken me quite some time to get to the stage where I'm able to share my story with you about what actually really went on and how I did end up in a divorce. And there was lots and lots of things that went on during that time. And we both went through a hell of a lot. But the impact that I think it had on us as individuals, and then jointly in our marriage and in our family dynamic that was now affecting our children as well, and always had done. But I think we were so busy surviving that you just don't notice sometimes when things are creeping up on you and it becomes a repetitive cycle and you've entered survival mode at some point and you don't know how you got there. So it ended up not being an armed police blowout like I think everyone was expecting. We didn't fight at the end. It was just a surrender and a defeat of a repetitive cycle of our whole marriage was just fighting to hold on to something that no longer existed, and we'd lost along the way somewhere. And how we ended up there was through continuous trauma, tragic incidents, things that happened, a lot of resentment build up, fighting to stay together to please everybody else. It was just normal. At the time that we got married, it wasn't how everybody thought it was. So in my generation, we were probably the first cycle breakers of the typical arranged marriage. Yes, my marriage was arranged, but I wasn't forced into marriage, and neither was he. We were introduced by family, And we were together for 2.5 years before we got married. So at that time, being very young as well, you don't really understand. And the way life was back then, and I think it was just generally for like all cultures, it wasn't just our culture, it was all cultures. If you weren't going to study, your job was to set up home, get married, have children, and that was your job basically. It was quite simple. It wasn't forced upon anybody. It was just the way the culture was. And like I said, it wasn't just our culture. It was what I've come to know now, all cultures, and no matter what your ethnic background was. So it was a very long time ago. I mean, I'm 48 now. I was 17 when I met him. And that was literally it became my purpose in life, was to set up home, get married, have children, and that was my life. And there was no left or right about it. That was my job, which I had no problem with. To be absolutely honest, I don't blame anybody for anything that happened. Nobody knew the trials and tribulations that we were going to face, and how they were going to come up. We were armed with a lot of circumstances. So once being married, we've got to the point where we didn't actually, when I look back on it now, even understand what marriage was. It was just, you just got married, and that was the end of that. And we ended up going through multiple situations in our life that ended up becoming circumstances, and it started to cause a bit of a damage. And I think on the outside, because we were never taught anything, and we were never taught about how to deal with these situations, because nobody ever spoke about things, and there was no guidance, there was no support. And it wasn't deliberate to anybody in particular. It was just the way the older generation was. You just don't talk about it. You just get on with it. It is what it is. Deal with it. So we did the best way we could. But in the end, it ended up causing us lots and lots of problems. And I think we become so detached and distant over the years. And despite all the prison sentences and the life of crime that was involved, me accepting everything, it still didn't work out. We were still defeated by all the trauma that happened. So the actual truth of what actually happened in the end was the fights and the arguments were getting really bad. And we were just surviving. And at some point during everything that had happened between us over the years, I'd entered survival mode. And during that survival mode, when I look back, I don't even know what I was doing. I've got huge blanks. I've got huge chunks of my life missing that I don't know how I got from A to B. And it has an impact. It has a huge impact on you as an individual. And I think we had just changed as people, or the situations and the traumas that we went through changed us as individuals. And we were fighting on to fighting to hold on to what once was. And that, when you keep doing that, you're just putting plasters on it, because the circumstances that we had gone through had changed us. We had gone through multiple prison sentences, multiple trouble. In our lives, there was a lot of stigmas we faced from society, from culture, expectations from families. And through all of that, and having children, we have 3 children together. When I had my eldest, he was in prison. When I had my second child, he ended up in prison. Literally straight after. There was all of that impact. Nobody actually saw how it impacted us as individuals, and it changed us as people. It changed us as people, without a doubt. But we were also in denial to ourselves. I know I definitely was. Denying the fact that it even affected me. The fake image and persona on top, just laughing everything off and telling everybody that, yeah, I'm fine, I'm okay. Not letting it affect me. But actually, I wasn't actually processing any of it. I wasn't processing any of those things that happened, and how I was raising children, and that second child with a disability. it was a lot that went on. And when he was born with no problems, and then he was diagnosed with Down syndrome within the same 24 hours that my husband was charged with murder. So that was an extremely traumatic and difficult time that we faced. But the flight or fight just wouldn't stop kicking in. And we kept fighting against it. And in the end, what happened after everything, and I will come back and talk on the depth of these things that happened later on in the platform, but at the end of the day, the way we would argue and we would fight, it was just so much trauma when I look back on it now, and the resentment, and the more I feel like he abandoned and resented me and rejected me, the more I kept fighting back, and the more I kept going back to him. And I, in this process, developed huge rejection and abandonment wounds that I didn't even know that I had. So sometimes we go through situations and we have no idea how we've ended up in these places. And looking at me on the outside, and everyone says, oh, you're such a confident woman. You're so, inspiring. And there's times when I look at it and I just think to myself, I don't even know how you see me that way, because the amount of stuff that's gone on is unbelievable. It's, and how I fought, I don't understand how I fought it. I don't know where the strength came from, but it had become normal to be rejected and abandoned by the marriage, by the husband. It was normal, absolutely normal to me. I didn't know any other way. It was like I'd been conditioned into a way of being and a way of life. Because I was so young, I just didn't know, and people look at me now and they just think, how did you end up in that situation, Ram? Well, I was young and I was naive. I didn't know. I was just a child myself in the grand scheme of things. When I've looked at my children at those ages, I've looked at other children and I think, oh, you're all grown up now and you're like 17, 18, but actually you're just a child. And so was I. So that's a reality that I've had to sit there with myself and face, that I was just a child myself. I didn't know any better. And I've had to sit there and forgive myself for things that happened because I just didn't know, and accept that. So the fighting got really bad. I mean, it was aggressive, it was violent. Even if he thought I would fight back even harder. And I felt like I was starting to go mad because it just wouldn't stop. The spiralling out of control wouldn't stop. There was alcohol abuse, drug abuse, everything involved. And it was, then you've got all the criminal activity and just the continuous cycle of rejection. That it all just became normal to me. It was just a normal way of life. And I accepted everything about him. I accepted all of this about him, and I accepted all the damaged parts of him, all of the wounded parts of him, but I just don't feel like he ever accepted me. And that's what it felt like. I'm not saying that's what he did, but as a behaviour expert now, it makes me, that was the way it made me feel. That when I look back, that's how I felt. And with the fighting and the arguing and how bad it got, I was becoming more and more withdrawn, detached, separating myself. And the kids have got older now. They're now starting to do their own thing. And I'm looking at my situation and the reality, no matter how much I'm trying to run from it and escape it, and I'm trying not to face myself, it was still there, and I just couldn't run from it no more. And now it's all come to a head. And what ended up happening right at the end of it, we had a huge blowout argument. And during that argument, he actually said to me, and they always say, be mindful of what you say because words have some serious power. And the words cut deep. And after all the prison sentences, and I risked my own life to get him out from that murder charge and everything else, I'd entered into a world that I knew nothing about. And everyone was saying to me, my extended family, you need to leave him, you need to leave him. And I was like, no, I can't do that to my kids and whatever, and I'm not going to leave him in that situation, you know. And I'm mentioning this now because it was a big but of my final decision. And he, during an argument that is now spilling out into the street, which is what no one knows about, in that moment, he turned around and said to me that you're just a fucking cunt that don't deserve to be my wife. And that my sticking by him through thick and thin was my duty, like I owed it to him somehow. And that cut so deep. And it might sound ridiculous to somebody else, but I would rather he'd beat the shit out of me. It would have been easier. And it would have been so much easier for me to get over. And even now, every time I look at him, like, because we have to communicate through the kids, that's all what I can see is those words that came out of his mouth. That after everything, I devoted and sacrificed my life to you. And that was the answer at the end of that, nearly 30 years, and through the battles that we fought. And I don't see any other wife risking her life with, I mean, I'd even sat in cars to save his life to find out the butt of what had gone on about situations with bombs underneath my seat. I shouldn't have been put in these situations where my safety was compromised to that level. But I was, and I did it. And I was devoted, completely devoted to my husband, how we were conditioned to believe that once you get married, doesn't matter what happens, you stick by it. But to then be told after all of that, I know what that meant to me. And that will hurt me forever. That I was the cunt that didn't deserve to be his wife. And my mental state must have been so horrific that I'd rather he'd battered me to death. That I would never have to, you know, those words, they will ring in my head forever. So to those that sit there and think, oh yeah, she's all right, and they were all right and everything else, the reality is that's what he thought of me. I owed it to him somehow. From that day, I vowed that I will never, ever, because I've survived this, abandon or reject myself ever again. Ever. Stop it there a minute, Toad. And so at the same time, while all this is going on, I've got, my children are witnessing all this. They're all witnessing it. My daughter's met somebody, she wants to settle down and get married. She's at an age now. She is about 23? My middle child is he was about at that time, about 20. And my youngest was 10. And my kids are now, like, they're at an understanding level. And where we sit there and we say, oh, you know, I have to stay for the kids, and the kids need a mum and dad and a house and everything else. And this is the kind of stuff that my kids were witnessing every day. And the impact that it's had on them. And the older two were very different with the way that they dealt with things. But my youngest is very, he voices his opinion. He's not afraid to say what he feels. And through all of this argument and what was happening and everything that was going on, my oldest said that, mine and the other ones, her brother's life has gone like that. Please don't F up his life as well. You two really need to find a way to sort it out, because she's now become so overprotective over her siblings that she's petrified of what's going to happen and the damage. And I've now got my kids questioning me. Now, I don't care what society or culture or anybody else wants to think or feel about it, because it's none of their goddamn business. But there was a lot of stuff that I actually went through, that I was facing, that was behind the scenes, that everybody doesn't really know about. And when you've now got your kids questioning you, as well as dealing with all of that, only you know in that situation what card you're being dealt now, that you're now going to have to do something about it. They're vulnerable. They're looking at you for answers. And then it was becoming increasingly distressing, and the walls were now caving in. And I knew that I had to do something about this, and I knew I had to start making a decision. And where I'd held on to things and I'd supported him through everything, thinking, one day my kids might question me and everything else, they actually ended up questioning me for different reasons. Why did I? So when we sit there thinking that we're doing this for our kids, and it's more important for our children to have a mum and a dad in a house, regardless of how we're existing, but we're under the same roof, it's actually extremely damaging. It's so psychologically damaging. It's unbelievable. And now I've got my kids throwing it in my face. So then my youngest turned around and said that I don't care. I don't care what you and dad do, but you don't need to be husband and wife to be our parents. And that for me was the ultimate slap on the face. Shame on us is how I felt. I felt so humiliated in that moment, more than anything that had ever gone on. That my now 10-year-old son is saying to me that you don't need to be married to be our parents. How shameful that your own 10-year-old child is saying that you're not even being our parents and trying to hold on to this nonsense. And he recognises it. So now I'm forced to make a decision, because it's not the child was the decider. This has been brewing and building up for how many years? More than 20 years. But now I haven't got an answer. I haven't got an answer. He's telling me to my face that you're damaging me. My responsibility as a parent is to keep my children safe. And now I'm not. And after all of that fight and everything that I thought that I was doing, because of just seeing patterns and there was no guidance and it was just what you just did and there was no, and it's nobody's fault how I ended up dealing with things and what happened, because nobody asked for or expected for these things to happen. I don't blame anybody. I don't blame anybody involved. I don't blame the people that introduced me to him. They done it with good intention. I don't blame the families. The families, his family gave me a lot of love. My family loved him also. The problem was us two. And it was now it was affecting our children in such a bad way that at the end of the day, ask yourself this when you're sitting there, and if you're in this situation where you don't know how to make a decision or whatever, sit there and think at the end of each day, who is left with your situation? You are. Your children are. Is it worth the damage that you're causing just to hold on to something that you're refusing to accept isn't working? Because you're causing further damage. That was what it was for me. I had to sit and trying to answer those questions to myself. That for the sake of everybody else, that we're now, we were just married on paper. There was no marriage existed between us. There was no anything of a husband and wife, how husbands and wives communicate and how they, live and exist. And we had none of it. To be honest, when I look back on it now, at the time where I was living in flight or fight, I hadn't noticed that there was just nothing there. But now I had to do something, and I had to put a stop to the whole cycle, because I had to choose myself in the end. And it might sound selfish to choose yourself, but actually my kids respected me for it till today, and I think they always will. And they're grateful that I chose myself, and that's all what they were crying out for. And I'm very blessed with the son-in-law that I have as well, that he also respected my decision and supported it, and was very understanding. And I had to choose myself, because if you don't choose yourself, you're not doing right by your children. And I had it all wrong in my situation. I'm not saying you yourself, like you have to do this, but I'm just saying that's what it was for me, that I had to choose myself. And the moment I chose myself in the situation, it stabilised all my children. It gave them the stability and the security that they needed. Yes, it was huge adjustments, but it ended up for the best. So there wasn't any, and with the history of the way we used to fight, there wasn't no huge armed police blowout. There wasn't no drama. There was no pushing and shoving. It was just an absolute defeat and an acceptance that it's over. What questions do you want to ask?
Just from there, right? When you said that it was over, was it a weight off your shoulders, or was it a weight on your shoulders?
It was when I made the decision at the time, it was a bit of a 50-50, because the uncertainty was weighing on me. I don't know how this is going to be, because I've spent my life with somebody. I don't know any other way of life. I didn't know any other way of life. That was all what I knew. I don't know what's going to happen from here. And I've got children looking at me like for direction, and I don't even know where I'm heading. The weight was, that is this happening? Like, you know, and I think people assume like you think you're free, but actually how burdened I was with the situation is what lifted the weight that I'd given myself, that security in making that decision. So I can't really confidently say that, yeah, you know, I'm free, you know, no, it doesn't work that way. It didn't work that way for me. It wasn't. I was under a lot of pressure at the time. A lot of pressure.
So you was married young?
Yeah, I was married young, yeah.
Why in our culture do you think it was okay to get people married young when potentially they weren't even ready for it?
Because they did it. Our parents did it. And it was just something that they brought from back home. They had come young, like, you know, my mum was young. I can only use my own example because I can't talk about other people. And it wasn't a bad thing. My mum and dad had an amazing marriage. They, like, as a couple, they were very authentic within themselves. They were very fun-loving. They had a very good balance, which is a funny thing, actually, because I've had a lot of people ask me questions that, judging by the kind of family that you come from, and, you know, normally you think that abusive or you know, neglectful relationships are what you've seen, and you've actually seen the opposite extreme. Like my grandparents and my parents were very fun-loving people, and they had like the most amazing masculine and feminine balance. They made everything work. There was never any fights or arguments in our house between our parents and our grandparents, how we were raised. And how I ended up in this is just a complete no idea. But in my opinion, it was just what they knew. They didn't know. They were in a foreign country. You know, we're first generation born here. Our parents were the first generation that came here. So through that, they were just continuing on what they came with. And they didn't have, not in my family anyway, there wasn't like, oh my God, we have to stay regimented like this and this is the way it goes. It was like, that's all they knew. And it was just going from generation to generation. But we were now British born and we were now exposed to multicultural, especially where I was raised. And it was a different cycle now. So yes, when I look back and I just think I was just a child myself, also at the time, it was just normal for everybody, regardless of culture. And I think it was because it worked for them. There was just this assumption that it would carry on being the same, but it wasn't. Must have been disappointing for that generation as well to see the broken down cycle of what was normal for them.
Why do you think marriages now have started again? These young marriages have come back.
There's two ways of looking at it. I think being much older and having children later on in life is tougher. And then people doing it younger, like I'm not even 50, but I've got adult children. My daughter's already married. You know, I can live my life, and technically I'm free in other people's eyes. The responsibility of a parent never goes, but things change. But I think there is a middle generation that wishes they were born in our generation, because I meet lots of different age groups, and wanting to get married younger and have children younger. I think you're more adaptable. You're more adaptable, but why exactly an individual does it for their circumstances now, I don't know. My daughter's got married young in comparison to a lot of my cousins, which is the middle generation that haven't got married. There's the between 35 to 40-year-olds that have held off single. But my daughter met a good young man, and they wanted to get on with their life. And I think if you meet the right person, that's what it's more about. But I think youngsters are more directed at what they want now, a bit more secure in who they are as people. So maybe that's why it's changed. But I do believe in life cycles, and I do believe in like generations, and things change and they go full circle and they come back to the beginning again.
Next one. You don't have to answer this, but it's just a thought, right? Because you're getting married off so young, was you prepared for what married life was? As in, did anybody sit you down and say to you, look, this is what your responsibilities are going to be. This is what's expected of you. For example, now that expectation isn't there because mindsets changed. You've got a lot of Western thoughts. You know, families ain't the same as what they used to be.
No, we were told nothing. Was told absolutely nothing. It didn't come with a manual. There was no, your mum set you down and had that chat. You know, from a teenager, you were actually prepared. You know, you should know how to do certain things to handle a married life. But I think what an actual, you know, the guidance was looking at your elders and just sort of like mimicking what they did. That's how simple life was for us. And it was, but again, the generational difference, we're living in a different time now. It didn't work for us because we're now wanting different things and wanting to experience different things. And there was this huge shift that had happened, but nobody had noticed. So I think it's that, yeah, there was absolutely no manual. There was no sitting down. There was no guidance. if you had a problem, you had to sort of like figure it out yourself. It was don't go to anybody with a problem. And it's not because anybody actually sat there, especially not in my family anyway. No one said that you can't come to us with a problem. It was just this something that because you just saw everybody else getting on with it that was older than you just sort of like mimicked the same behaviour. It's learned behaviours, isn't it? In the grand scheme of things, it was all a big learnt behaviour.
Do you think a lot of these South Asian women from your generation are in marriages that they can't get out of?
100%.
And that they don't know who to talk to?
100%.
And do you think a lot of them are just used as this, call it for what it is, say, punch bags?
Of course they are.
Why do you think they just cannot speak about it?
Because of shame. We're made to feel guilty. I think it's taken me a lot to get to the point to talk about it. And I think it's the fear. There's a lot of fear of being judged, because people do judge. People want to sit there and know your business and sit there and gossip in the temple about your business, but don't actually give a shit about what you're actually facing and what you're going through. And it's the judgment of society, judgment of culture. It's the judgment of you're less than. I mean, I've had some really ridiculous comments as well, but I just wouldn't put up with that. You know, even when you've been spoken down to and things like that in public. And it's like, yeah, you wouldn't, but there's a reason why I've shut my mouth and haven't said anything. Like, just because you deal with something a certain way doesn't mean the other person is. And you never know where somebody's at. And I think there's a lot of inconsiderate behaviour and judgment that goes on around it that it actually makes you shut down. And I think this is the reason why people don't speak about it. And quite often, you know, you might have a friend or somebody or a family member that may say something in laughing. Pay attention to what they're actually saying and maybe ask them, are you actually okay? You know, nobody actually asked me if I was ever okay. Nobody actually, it took a lot for me to have to figure everything out myself. And I think it's you don't know where you're going to go. There's often I've come to find out a lot of financial control and things like that, and not enough independence in these women where they, or even some men in the situations where they don't know how to get out and they don't know how they're going to start, or they just think, well, I'll just suffer the consequences because this is easy and it's known to me. I mean, I've entered a completely unknown. My entire life has been stripped out. People, places, things, everything. Where do you start? Where do you start? And I think there's just so much fear that goes on around it.
You mentioned about prison sentences and life of crime, and you said obviously you'll talk about that in more detail later on, right? But as a wife and then as a mother, how did you deal with that in terms of the community? I.e., you know, people talking behind your back, you know, people are making comments, you know, they're saying, you know, that's the wife of so-and-so, or that's, you know what I mean, the daughter of so-and-so. Like, how do you guys deal with that? And notice it have an impact on the kids?
A lot of things were kept from the kids. We don't live in community. I live in, like I said, which was also due to the circumstances of the crime life. But I live in a completely different community where nobody knows anyone's business or whatever. And I think that was the ultimate for the survival. But when I was armed with like businesses and having to be in culture and be around those cultural communities, and all our relatives live in those kind of cultural communities, it was a very known fact of who I was, and the sniggering and the snarling, and there was a lot of stigmas that I faced. And I tried my best to keep my children away from it so that they could be free to be themselves. And that was the best decision I made, because they didn't grow up or going to school with people in a community where everyone was like, that's so-and-so's daughter or son, and he did this and he did that. And and all of that. It was, they at least had that freedom. But every so often, when you were stepping in and out, and when they were younger, I used to have a lot more to do with the community. And obviously where we were married and I'm coming in and out because they're all from there, it was very difficult to just laugh it off. And this is where I'd developed the laughing it off on the surface, but deep down it was very hurtful, and very upsetting. I mean, I've gone through situations where in the heat of a lot of his cases, that if I entered into West London, people would cross the road because they knew who I was to get away from me. And I hadn't even committed the crime. Just for being his wife, I was cursed, I was sworn out. And it's one of those things that when somebody goes inside, your family's still suffering on the outside, and that also has a huge impact on how they feel. I mean, I've even gone into weddings, and somebody actually said, "Oh, the gangster's moles here," and I just first wanted to smack the guy in the face, and then I was like, I actually need to leave because this is the way people are judging me now, and that is what I'd become, and that's how everybody saw me. It wasn't people that were connected to me directly, it was how people in society were seeing me and talking about me. So I was very fortunate that I was able to be in a position to raise my kids away from all of that. And my kids have faced it. Don't get me wrong. They faced the fact that as they've got older and they found out, the truth when they can cope with it. I'm not one to lie and hide things from my kids. But when they found out and then, worried that people might not want to be friends with them because of who their dad was. And I say was because he's not in all that anymore. But when kids are growing up and that stuff's still going on, it's frightening for a child because then it affects their friendships and how people see them. So protecting their identity and everything else has always been paramount for me.
What impact does prison have on a family?
Huge impact.
As in, I'm talking about both, say, financially, both, physically, everything. As in, you can't do anything.
You can't, I don't know how, the only way I can describe it, what it felt like for me, it's like when somebody dies and suddenly they've just gone like that. It's not, you've gone to court, this person's now not coming home. It feels like that whole, you're riding the motions, you're losing something, your grip's slipping. It's not in your control now. You've got a higher authority that's now dictating everything that goes on. And you're powerless. And your whole life's about to change, but you don't actually realise how much it changes. And you've now got to feed kids and there isn't an income and what do you do now? I was very, very lucky that I had a very supportive family. Like my parents, my grandparents, my sisters, they were all there. And they helped me raise my kids. And I was very lucky to have that. And I will, it's an invaluable support that got me through. Maybe that's why I've survived everything, such severe trauma, because I had all that. I had that support, just even if they weren't really just doing or saying anything, just looking over my shoulder, knowing they were there. I was comforted by their presence. And that was priceless. But it puts your life on a standstill. In more ways than one, because there's in a couple dynamic and in a family dynamic, there's a lot of progress that you would make or you were trying to move forward and develop in other ways, but your actual development halts. Financially, it puts strain. Things can't, and with the fact that my second child was diagnosed with a disability, I was armed with even worse because now there's no way I can go and work. there's no way I can go and work. I've got, my oldest is 3. He's now got a disability, the baby who's 2 months old. And I've got a husband in prison on very serious charges. So, but I also learned that with the right support, you can actually survive with nothing as well. I didn't have the lifestyle. I didn't have all of that everyone seems to think that I had. There was nothing. Then you're starting again when they come out, because you now got to rebuild, haven't you? You've got to restart from scratch. Then it goes and happens again, and then you're back to square one again. But now it's become like that conveyor belt. It's normal. Oh, I know the drill now.
You mentioned, about fights. Were these physical fights or just verbal?
Both physical and verbal.
Can you define a little bit more about the physical fights?
Physical fights were, would be off the back of the alcohol and drug abuse. It would, the fits of rage. It was all of that. And when it's a ticking time bomb. It's a ticking time bomb. But again, when you enter into those cycles and things like that start happening, and it's blamed on drug and alcohol abuse, you become an enabler to the abuse as well, which is the way I felt it was. And then it's okay to say, like, I'm sorry when you're sober and you're not going to do it again. But then that became a whole abusive cycle that just became normal as well over the years. It was, and I'd developed a mechanism of coping around it and managing myself around it to avoid the situation in the first place.
Do you think could you tell the difference between him on the influence and him not under the influence? And did you ever kind of blame it on him being under the influence of him behaving the way he was?
Yeah, of course. Of course, because it's easier for you to, because there's shame to yourself as well, you see. Like I felt ashamed of myself to myself. But at the same time, it was like, I didn't know any other way how to deal with it. So it was like, okay. And then you'd hear about other people that when they, under the influence of drink and drugs, these things happen. And I'd heard about it, but I'd never spoken about my own. So it was just, okay, that can just happen then. But I think I was in such flight or fight that I hadn't actually thought of the depths of it. I was just scratching the surface of everything. But it was easier for me to deal with myself by blaming it on the drugs and alcohol. But actually the abusive behaviour had, in other ways, been there, like present, even without the drugs and alcohol, which I hadn't noticed because it was at heightened levels. So you can very easily, it's easy for others to make the judgment and say, how did you end up like that? I wouldn't, But actually it's manipulation. It's all of that comes into it, like narcissistic behaviour. It's like you're groomed into these situations and conditioned in a way because of the lack of knowledge as well that we come from.
There's another point that you made about, you went to survival mode. What is survival mode? Is it you just shutting down, or is it?
Yeah.
As in not knowing what day of the week it is, what time it is, or is it just accepting what's going on and putting your head in the clouds?
For me, for me, survival, I'd actually entered flight or fight at some point in my life that I don't even know. It must have been way more than 20 years ago. I reckon it must have been around 25, to be honest. 25 years I must have lived in flight or fight. It's the numbness. It's easier to dead yourself out than to sit with yourself. So there's no emotion. I had no emotions. I would be smiling and laughing on the surface, but there wasn't any real emotions. It was just skim. I wasn't processing anything, absolutely nothing. I would look the part because I look back at myself and think to myself, oh my God, I look really bloody normal. I look really normal, and I'm there, but I don't remember being there. I don't remember driving places. I don't remember going places. I don't remember wearing clothes. I don't remember owning things. I've got huge chunks that are just a complete blank. And if I told you I knew, I would definitely be making it up. And I just can't. It's taken me a lot to accept that I lived in that flight or fight for like around 25 years of my life. And I was just so dead and numb to emotions. Pain, didn't feel pain. I'd end up with knocking my arms and legs and bruises and from moving things around and even just stuff with kids. And I could press them. I wouldn't feel a thing. I could cut myself cooking with a knife. I wouldn't feel it. I'd see the blood, but I couldn't feel it. But I didn't notice. And what I'd actually put it down to was having an extremely high pain threshold. But actually, it was flight or fight. And I realised that after, when my trauma started to surface, after my divorce came through, and I'm starting to feel. So I couldn't, I still struggle with emotions. I can't, happy, sad, I'd had griefs and losses, and I've seen a lot of death over the years as well. Didn't cry. It just happens. So in my situation, I'd completely deaded myself out to not feel anything. Because it was self-protect, protecting myself.
When you speak about your son, versus say, a relationship and a marriage, do you feel as though you raised your son with a disability by yourself against the husband issues, against the community issues? Did you ever receive any support from anyone? And what was his relationship like with his dad?
When raising him, it was like I was just a single parent, despite being married. The support that I received wasn't directly from him. It was actually all of my family. And I think that's how I coped and managed, because I was very blessed. But me being a single parent now is no different, because I managed all the children and everything that came with it, and had done it all my life, even when he was there. So, but I also think that boy saved me somehow as well, because what I could have been like if, I don't even know what would have happened to me if I didn't have him to care for when he was up there on serious charges. So I became dedicated and devoted into caring and raising my child. But I was supported by my family without a doubt. But where he was concerned, even when he did come out, he was so far detached.
In hindsight, knowing what you know now, if you could you have got out of your marriage earlier?
Yeah and no. And I say yeah for the sake of the kids. I should have made the decision earlier. But at the same time, the reason why I say no, because the time was now. And I believe in timing of your life. And I think when you're in a situation like mine, The timing is crucial because you can't really leave a door open to get all the... when you go through like breakdown of a relationship like that, women especially, I can't talk for men, but they start ticking boxes in their mindset. And what we end up doing is that it's like when you're looking for somebody, you have a checklist. We also have a get out list, unknowingly, that goes on in our head. And it's like, right, that's, you know, and when a woman's voicing something and you're not doing nothing about it, no, she's ticking you off her list. I'll tell you that straight, because there's only so much she's going to take from it. But I think I was tick boxing, that's happened now. And I think when you're in a situation like mine, you've got to know that when you're going to walk away is going to be final, because you cannot leave a door open to go back and try again. That would have been more damaging and more dangerous. Without a doubt. Without a doubt. So I think my timing was right now. It happened at the right time. Although people question me about why now at this stage, daughter's getting married and all this bloody rubbish. Well, that might work for you. It doesn't work for me. But anyway, my time was right now. And I think if I'd done it any sooner, I think it would have been a hell of a lot worse.
Right. I've got 2 more questions. The first one is to do with, you know, like this kind of in the community, elders talking, etc., etc. Like, if these elders were sat in front of you right now, who were gossiping about you, etc., what would you kind of say to them? What would you say about this gossiping nature in our culture? Everyone wants to know the dirt about others.
I'll say it to them now. I say to them about the damage that they're causing. I've received a lot of gossip, just generally, not just because they're married, but because the way I look aesthetically. I've had all sorts of kind of stigmas and things that people, you know, come at me with, and the older generation. And I've actually started hitting out and started saying things now. And I just tell them how it is, that the damage that they're causing and the fact that it's hurtful and it's upsetting. And there was one incident where one of my aunties kept saying to me, this around the time my daughter was getting married, and she kept saying, oh, you don't look like a mother-in-law, and look at your hair, and you need to grow your hair, and you guys need to behave yourself, and don't leave him now, and, you know, all this bloody nonsense was going on. And I was like, you were so desperate for me to get married when I was young, and you were so desperate for me to have children. I've done everything that everyone expected of me, and now you're telling me that I look too young to be a mother-in-law. What the hell has my hair got to do with it? And what the hell? I am still her mother. I'm still going to be the boy's mother-in-law. But what does the way I look have to do with it? And it's, they say things they don't understand. They actually just don't understand the damage that they're causing by the things that they're saying. So who's right or wrong in this situation? Because are we taking offence to the depth and the old granny is just thinking out loud? I mean, I've started saying it in a light-hearted way, and I've started like laughing it off and saying, you know, what I want to say. I'm not rude and abusive and disrespectful about it. But again, it's one of those. I don't think they deliberately mean it, and I don't think they do it to cause any harm. I just don't think they think that deep. They had a thought, they've just said it. And I think quite often we sit there feeling offended about what they say. But they may not even mean it like that.
The last question on my side is, do you actually think your ex-husband meant what he said? Or do you think it was in the heat of the moment?
I know he meant it. And it was the look in his eyes. And I can still see those eyes every time. You see, people can do and say a lot of things, but the truth always lies in the eyes. The eyes never lie. And it was that, what I could see in his eyes in that moment, he meant it. And he may claim that he meant it. He didn't mean it, and it was just in the heat of the moment. But for you to say that after all this time, and I've dedicated and devoted my life to you through thick and thin, I've done more than my fair of a duty as a wife to you. You've just thrown everything in my face. He threw that's what it felt like to me, that he just slapped it in my face. Would he go back and change it? I don't know. I think we were going to split anyway. I don't think it would have changed anything. I don't think it would have changed anything, because I think the split was inevitable. It was happening. But in that moment, I know that he meant it. But I've accepted that he can feel however he wants about me, and he can do and say what he wants, and he's got every right to live the life that he wants. But I no longer have to accept it and settle for less than what I deserve, and settle for what I want in life anymore, because my life is equally as important to live. And when people say, and they see, you know, my outside image, and they think about all these things, I've gone through tough journeys, but there's still people that have been through even worse levels of abuse than me. But I wouldn't go back and change it. And it might sound twisted, but I wouldn't change anything that happened. I wouldn't change the experience, and I definitely don't regret it. I don't regret marrying him. I don't regret having my kids. I don't regret sticking by him. I don't regret any of it. But it's what built me to who I am today. And for that, I'm grateful for the experience.
And then just closing thoughts. Anyone that's going through what you're going through, I know you can't obviously compare and directly give advice, but what would you say?
I would say stay true to yourself. It's a journey that I think every individual man or woman goes through on their own and processes things on their own. But I think having a reality check with yourself, quietly to yourself, and if you can seek independent advice from somebody to air your thoughts, even if you feel like you're being judged or by anybody that you know. Sometimes we can't even talk to our best friend because of like shame or you don't want them to know or whatever. But there are even like doctors and things like that, GPs, they can put you in touch with people, or even independent groups or things like that, like trying to find out what's local to you or where you might be able to find. And if not, there's always me. You can always reach out to me and ask me. I'm happy for the confidentiality, because I know and I genuinely understand how difficult it is. I suppressed it and I kept it to myself, but that suppression was making me sick and it was making me ill. No one knows how my heart was thudding out of my chest and I was waking up at random times that I almost burst a vessel in my brain. It affects your health. But that suppression, it can kill you, even if you're not physically abused. The stress. So talk to somebody, try to find somebody, or even by connecting through my platform or messaging me independently on Real Talk Rami and keeping it anonymous, that you just want direction. It will stay confidential. But reach out, it helps.